September 8th, 1900, a Saturday morning. People in Galveston, Texas, woke up to something that felt almost pleasant. A warm breeze off the Gulf, an overcast sky, and waves that were bigger than usual, but not enough to worry anyone. Kids played on the beach. Families went about their weekends. A few people even walked down to the shore just to watch the surf. By nightfall, over 8,000 of them were dead. No one saw it coming. Not clearly, not in time. And what makes this story so difficult to sit with is that it wasn't entirely unforeseeable. The warnings existed. The science existed. People had said for years that Galveston was vulnerable in a way that few cities in America were. They just chose not to believe it. This is the story of the deadliest natural disaster in United States history. A single storm that didn't just kill thousands of people. It erased a city that had considered itself untouchable. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what Galveston actually was. By 1900, Galveston was one of the most prosperous cities in the entire American South. It sat on a barrier island along the Texas coast, a long, flat strip of land separated from the mainland by a shallow bay, and its location had made it wealthy. The port of Galveston was the busiest in Texas and among the top cotton exporting ports in the world. Banks, telegraphs, newspapers, hotels, the finest restaurants between New Orleans and San Francisco, all of it was concentrated on this narrow island. The city had electric streetcars before most of America did. It had a medical college, an opera house, and a cotton exchange that handled hundreds of millions of dollars in trade every year. People called it the Queen City of the Gulf, and they meant it without irony. It was, by every measurable standard, a boom town that had arrived. The population sat at around 38,000, making it the largest city in Texas at the time, edging out even Houston. And the residents of Galveston were proud of that fact. They had built something real on a sandbar in the Gulf of Mexico, and it had worked. What they had not accounted for was the ground beneath their feet. The island rose at its highest point, barely 8.7 feet above sea level. Most of it sat even lower than that. And it had nothing. No seawall, no barrier, no protection, standing between it and whatever the Gulf decided to send. Here's something that gets glossed over in most accounts of the Galveston disaster. People knew, not everyone, and not with certainty, but the risk was not a secret. As far back as the 1870s, engineers and civic planners had noted that the island was dangerously exposed. A proposal to build a seawall had been floated and then quietly set aside. The cost was significant. The city was thriving. Why spend money defending against a catastrophe that might never come? There was also a specific, almost willful blindness at work. When Isaac Klein, the chief meteorologist for the U.S. Weather Bureau in Galveston, published an article in 1891, he argued that the Texas coast's geography made a serious hurricane strike essentially impossible. His reasoning was partly based on science and partly based on something harder to define, a kind of institutional confidence that the worst-case scenario was too extreme to plan for. He was wrong, and he would live long enough to know exactly how wrong he was. The storm that would hit Galveston in 1900 was not an anomaly. The Gulf of Mexico had produced devastating storms before. Cuba had been devastated by a hurricane just days before the storm reached Texas. The signals were there, but the communication systems of the eras were slow. The meteorological models were primitive, and the culture of the time leaned toward optimism over caution. Galveston had weathered storms before. It would weather this one too. That assumption cost everything. By Thursday, September 6th, the weather had begun to shift. Tropical reports filtering up from Cuba described a violent storm moving north across the Caribbean. Isaac Klein and the Weather Bureau were aware of it, but the tracking technology of the era made pinpoint prediction nearly impossible. The storm could veer east toward Florida. It could weaken over land. It could do a dozen things that were not head directly toward Galveston. On Friday, the sky darkened. The barometric pressure began dropping. Swells were rolling in from the south. Long, slow waves that traveled far ahead of a storm system, the ocean's way of sending a message before the storm itself arrived. Saturday morning, September 8th, Klein woke early and rode his horse down to the beach. What he saw unsettled him. The surf was high, unusually high, and the water was already beginning to push inland across the lower portions of the island. He rode through the beachfront neighborhoods, warning people to move to higher ground. Though on an island where higher ground meant 4 or 5 feet of elevation, that was a relative term. At the Weather Bureau office, reports were coming in indicating the storm had turned. It was heading toward Galveston. The warning went out. But in 1900, there were no sirens, no emergency broadcasts, no text alerts. Word spread the way it always had, person to person, slowly, and filtered through individual judgment about whether to take it seriously. Many people didn't. After all, it was a Saturday. The surf was high, but storms came and went. A lot of people chose to watch from their porches rather than flee. By late morning, the water was already running down the streets. By midday, Galveston was already flooding. This was not unusual in a storm. The low-lying areas near the beach always took on water. What was unusual was the direction of the water. It was coming from both sides. The Gulf was pushing in from the south, and the bay on the north side of the island was backing up, flooding the streets from the other direction. The island was being swallowed from both ends. People who had stayed in their homes began to realize too late that leaving was no longer an option. The bridges connecting Galveston to the mainland had already been overwhelmed. The water in the streets was thigh-deep, then waist-deep, and rising fast. The wind was building towards speeds that made standing upright nearly impossible. By mid-afternoon, the storm was producing sustained winds above 100 miles per hour. The Weather Bureau's wind gauge was destroyed before it could record the peak, an indication of how far beyond the instruments the storm had gone. The city's infrastructure was failing in real time. The electric grid went down, the telegraph lines snapped, gas mains ruptured, and the water kept rising. Structures that had been built with confidence, two-story homes, brick commercial buildings, public halls, were being tested in ways their builders had never anticipated. The storm surge, which would later be estimated at 15 feet or more, was not just water. It carried debris, lumber, roofing, the remnants of houses that had already collapsed upstream, moving like battering rams through what remained. By evening, the storm had become something that defied the language people had available to describe it. Let me put this in terms that are easier to hold in your head. Galveston, in 1900, had 38,000 residents. By the time the storm passed, somewhere between 6,000 and 12,000 of them were dead. Historians have debated the exact number for over a century, but the conservative estimate is 8,000. That means roughly 1 in 5 people in the city died in a single night. To put that in proportion, more Americans died in Galveston on September 8, 1900, than died in any other natural disaster in American history, before or since. The San Francisco earthquake of 1906, the Johnstown flood of 1889, Hurricane Katrina in 2005, none of them killed as many people as this one storm killed in this one city in a single night. That number is not a statistic. It's a measure of an entire social fabric being severed. The worst of it hit between 7 and 9 p.m. By then, the water across most of Galveston was 10 to 15 feet deep. The island had effectively ceased to exist as land. Thousands of people were clinging to whatever structure remained above water. Rooftops, trees, the upper floors of sturdy brick buildings. Many of those structures didn't hold. Isaac Klein spent the peak of the storm inside his own house with his wife, 2 daughters, and roughly 50 neighbors who had taken shelter with the family. The house was eventually lifted off its foundation and carried several blocks before it broke apart. Klein's wife did not survive. He did, holding onto wreckage in the dark water for hours. Across the island, similar scenes were unfolding by the thousands. Families separated in the flood. Children lost hold of their parents. People watched their neighbors disappear into water that was black and moving fast and full of broken wood and brick. The noise was unlike anything the survivors would ever find adequate words for. Wind, water, the constant percussion of debris, and underneath it all, the sound of buildings collapsing. Some structures held. St. Mary's Infirmary, a solid masonry building near the center of the island, became a refuge for hundreds. The Ursuline Convent sheltered over 1,000 people through the night. The Union Depot, built of heavy brick, stood. Those who reached these buildings survived. Those who didn't often didn't get another chance. By midnight, the storm had passed. The wind dropped. The water began to pull back toward the Gulf, and the island of Galveston sat in the dark, quietly ruined. When the sun came up on September 9th, the survivors began to understand what had happened. 3,600 buildings were gone. Not damaged. Gone. Entire neighborhoods that had existed the day before were now open ground covered in debris 15 feet deep in places. The wreckage had formed a kind of enormous natural seawall along the south side of the island, a compressed mass of lumber, furniture, clothing, and the bodies of those who hadn't made it. The bodies were everywhere. In the days that followed, the living tried to bury the dead. They loaded bodies onto barges and took them out to sea, but the Gulf returned them to shore. Eventually, city leaders made the grim decision to burn them where they lay. Funeral pyres burned across Galveston for days. The smell carried for miles. One woman named Clara Barton, then 78 years old, arrived with the Red Cross and organized relief efforts. She had been running disaster response since the Civil War, and even she described Galveston as unlike anything she had seen. "I have been in many disasters," she wrote to a colleague, "but nothing like this." Survivors described not grief, exactly, but a kind of suspended disbelief. The scale of what had happened was too large to process at once. People would be helping with debris removal and then stop because they had recognized a piece of furniture that had belonged to a neighbor. The personal and the catastrophic kept colliding. Galveston did not collapse as a city. What happened next is actually one of the more remarkable things about this story. Within days, the city's leadership had convened to make decisions. Within weeks, a plan was in place. And over the following years, Galveston did 2 things that were, for the era, astonishing in scale. First, they built the seawall, A concrete barrier, initially 17 feet high and more than 10 miles long, eventually extended further, was constructed along the southern edge of the island. It stands today. Second, and even more remarkably, they raised the entire city. Galveston dredged sand from the Gulf, pumped it underneath buildings using a system of canals, and literally elevated the island by as much as 17 feet in some areas. They jacked up existing structures, including a 3,000-ton Catholic church, moved one brick at a time, and filled in beneath them. It took years and cost what would today be hundreds of millions of dollars, but they did it. These engineering projects are, even by modern standards, impressive. At the time, they were nearly unprecedented. The disaster did more than kill people. It fundamentally altered the balance of power in Texas. Before 1900, Galveston was the dominant city in the state, the financial center, the trade hub, the cultural capital. After the storm, that position was gone. Houston, sitting safely 50 miles inland, moved aggressively to capture the trade that Galveston could no longer guarantee. The Houston Ship Channel was dredged in the years following the disaster, eventually giving Houston its own deep-water port. The railroad lines shifted. The money followed. Galveston recovered, but it never again held the position it once had. The Queen City of the Gulf became, over the following decades, a regional city, significant but no longer dominant. Houston would grow to become one of the largest cities in America. Galveston's population today is roughly 50,000, modestly more than it had in 1900, over 120 years later. The storm also accelerated changes in how the United States thought about disaster preparedness and meteorological forecasting. The Weather Bureau's failure to accurately predict and communicate the threat led to significant reforms in how hurricane warnings were issued and disseminated. It was one of the early catalysts for what would, over the following century, develop into the modern hurricane warning system. It would be easy to look at Galveston as a relic, a 19th century disaster in an era before satellites and storm tracking and emergency management systems. And there's something to that. The specific failures of 1900 could not be replicated today in the same way. But the underlying dynamic, a prosperous community built in an exposed location, confident in its own resilience, slow to invest in protection against a risk that felt theoretical, that pattern has not gone away. After Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans in 2005, the parallels to Galveston were impossible to ignore. A city on low-lying ground, a levee system that engineers had warned for years was inadequate, an assumption embedded in the culture of the city that the big one would go somewhere else. Nearly 2,000 people died. The city's poorest residents were disproportionately among them. After Hurricane Harvey stalled over Houston in 2017 and dumped more rainfall on a single American city than any storm in recorded history, the question came up again. Why had this region, knowing what it knew, developed in ways that made flooding inevitable? The answer was, as it so often is, a combination of economic pressure, short-term thinking, and the human tendency to treat a disaster that hasn't happened yet as a disaster that won't. Galveston's seawall is still there. It's been tested many times. But Galveston itself, the modern city, sits in a region where the risks associated with rising sea levels and increasingly intense Gulf storms are growing, not shrinking. The seawall that was built in 1902 is now under discussion for expansion. A proposed Ike Dike, named for Hurricane Ike, which struck the region in 2008, has been studied and debated for over a decade. Progress has been slow. The pattern holds. Protection deferred is not protection. Galveston had been warned for years before 1900 that it was vulnerable. The seawall proposal was shelved because the city was doing well and the threat was abstract. The cost of not building that wall was paid in human life. And then the wall was built anyway, at far greater expense and after immeasurable loss. Infrastructure reflects values. The decision to raise Galveston's grade level after the storm was extraordinary, and it happened because the community chose to make it happen, despite the cost and complexity. What we build and what we protect says something about what we actually prioritize, as opposed to what we say we prioritize. Disasters don't create vulnerability, they reveal it. The storm didn't make Galveston fragile. Galveston was already fragile. The storm simply made it impossible to look away from a reality that had always been true. That's how most disasters work. The conditions are present for years or decades before the event. The event is the moment the bill comes due. Survivors shape the story. The people who rebuilt Galveston after 1900 had a choice. They could have left. Many did. But enough stayed and organized and funded and built that a city still exists there today. The seawall, the grade raising, the redesigned city, those are not just engineering projects, they're acts of will. There's something worth remembering in that. Here's what I find myself thinking about when I sit with this story. Galveston in 1900 was not a careless place. It was a sophisticated, educated, economically thriving city full of people who were reasonably well-informed and competent. They were not reckless. They were not stupid. They simply could not make themselves believe, in the sustained and operational way that produces real action, that the worst-case scenario was actually coming for them. That is the most human thing in this entire story. Not the disaster, but the refusal. Quiet, understandable, universal, to fully prepare for one. The storm lasted one night. The decisions that determined how many people died were made over the previous 30 years. The most dangerous water is the kind that's always been still.